Key 1. Stoic throughout history. The true character of leaders has often been revealed in their response to failure, and no one captures this more sharply than Robert Greene, who once said that a leader's reaction to adversity exposes the essence of their nature. But when it comes to narcissistic leaders, this truth becomes even more evident. These leaders are often defined by their intense need for validation and their fiery rage in response to criticism. Their egos are fragile, and their thirst for revenge can cloud their judgment, blinding them to the reality around them. This is the topic I want to explore today: the dangers of narcissistic leadership, something the Stoics knew all too well. The Stoics, especially those who held power, understood the weight of leadership. Marcus Aurelius, for example, often warned against the perils of vanity and self-delusion. But not every leader heeded such counsel. One tragic example is Nero, who was adopted by the Roman emperor and groomed to take his place. From an early age, Nero was surrounded by luxury and privilege, but also had access to some of the best philosophers of the time. His teacher, Seneca, even introduced him to Stoic philosophy. But despite these powerful influences, Nero's reign became a stark contrast to that of Marcus Aurelius. Nero's downfall wasn't simply a matter of poor decision-making. It was a case of a leader who became consumed by his own ego. Nero was addicted to adoration. He surrounded himself with people who flattered him, telling him he was the greatest poet, the most talented charioteer, and a beloved ruler. He rigged chariot races just to claim victory, and he exiled anyone who surpassed him in talent. His craving for attention was insatiable, so much so that it warped his ability to see the truth. He lived in a bubble, surrounded by sycophants who fed his delusions. And, tragically, it was this very vanity that made him vulnerable to manipulation and dishonesty. Nero's story is a powerful reminder of the dangers of narcissism in leadership. His vanity led him to create a distorted world where everyone around him was forced to affirm his greatness. In fact, he even arranged for slaves to cheer for him during chariot races to give the illusion of popularity. It didn't matter that these gestures were hollow. Nero's fragile ego needed constant reassurance. His behavior escalated as he grew more paranoid. After murdering his wife, he even found a male slave who resembled her, dressing him up to pretend he was still married to her. This is what we call the dictator's trap. When a leader's ego is fragile, and when they surround themselves with people too afraid to speak the truth, they lose touch with reality. Instead of confronting their failures, they lie to themselves. Nero, for example, continued to think of himself as a great ruler, despite the fact that his empire was crumbling. When faced with crises, such as the Great Fire of Rome, instead of rising to the occasion and uniting the people, he used the tragedy as an excuse for his own grandiose building projects and scapegoated the Christians. Seneca, a wise Stoic, repeatedly warned Nero about his delusions and narcissism. He tried to steer him away from this path, but to no avail. Nero became more isolated and dismissive of his advisors, cutting himself off from the wisdom that might have saved him. Power did not corrupt him. It revealed who he truly was: a fragile, paranoid man who lacked the fortitude to face difficult truths. The truth is that narcissistic leaders are often deeply insecure. Beneath their facade of confidence lies a constant fear of being exposed as inadequate. This is what makes them so dangerous. Their need to eliminate threats, even imagined ones, leads them to make irrational decisions, as we saw with Nero's brutal purges. But this type of leadership is unsustainable. Eventually, the weight of lies, deceit, and delusion becomes too much to bear. Green's insight about a leader's response in a crisis is crucial. When a narcissistic leader faces adversity, their true character is revealed. For Nero, that character was one of fragility and fear. In the end, his leadership was defined not by strength or wisdom, but by insecurity and delusion. His reign spiraled into chaos and cruelty, leaving a wake of destruction in its path. This is why it is so essential for leaders to remain grounded in truth, humility, and self-awareness. The Stoics knew this well. Leaders must be willing to confront uncomfortable truths and make tough decisions, not simply surround themselves with people who tell them what they want to hear. True leadership requires a balance of power, responsibility, and a willingness to grow. Narcissistic leaders, like Nero, may start with potential, but if they don't check their egos, they are doomed to spiral into ruin. Key 1. Stoic Nero's reign is a stark example of what happens when a leader's ego outweighs their capability. Stoic philosophers like Theses and Helvidius stood as a powerful resistance against Nero, refusing to submit to his delusional grasp on power. Nero's inability to tolerate opposition was his fatal flaw. He couldn't stand anyone questioning his actions, especially not the Stoics, who held firmly to truth and justice. This constant clash between the emperor's tyranny and the Stoics' moral integrity created a cycle of conflict, one where Nero's paranoia and insecurity led him to eliminate anyone who didn't flatter or comply with him. One of the Stoics, Agrippinus, even earned Nero's ire simply by not attending the emperor's lavish parties, rejecting the notion that he was entitled to universal adoration. This refusal to be part of Nero's self-constructed reality was a challenge to his fragile ego, a move that Nero simply couldn't accept. Similarly, Helvidius was banished after expressing admiration for Brutus, the man who killed Caesar, because Nero saw this as a threat to his absolute rule. Nero's paranoia reached its peak when he decided Theses had to be silenced. He was a man who insisted on honesty and virtue, making him the perfect enemy for a ruler who thrived on deception and corruption. Theses's refusal to bow to Nero's power only intensified their conflict. When accused of false charges, he didn't beg for mercy or submit. Instead, he faced his accusers with dignity, demanding they name their charges openly. Even as Nero sentenced him to death, Theses remained unyielding, declaring, "Nero can kill me, but he cannot harm me," signifying his belief that virtue and integrity were beyond the reach of tyranny. Ultimately, Nero's cruelty and incompetence were his undoing. As he became increasingly isolated, even from those close to him, his rule descended into chaos. In a particularly chilling moment, Nero ordered the execution of Seneca, the man who had raised him like a son. But Seneca, knowing what was coming, wasn't surprised. He understood that Nero's character was always destined to lead to violence and betrayal. The signs had been there all along. Nero's downfall was inevitable. His inability to take responsibility, his vanity, and his narcissism created a vicious cycle that spiraled into madness. When the end came, Nero couldn't face it like a man. He was too weak to end his own life and had to rely on others to do the job. His final words, "This is loyalty," are a tragic reflection of his distorted worldview, where loyalty meant unquestioning support of his selfish desires. He never understood what it meant to be virtuous or to lead with integrity. This story is not just ancient history. It's a timeless cautionary tale. Leaders like Nero, driven by self-interest and narcissism, ultimately destroy themselves. But the Stoics remind us that character is fate. Nero's fall was a direct result of his bad character, his inability to lead with wisdom, humility, or truth. Fast forward to modern times, and the echoes of Nero's leadership style can be seen in figures like Donald Trump, whose behavior as president mirrored many of Nero's flaws. Like Nero, Trump rejected the advice of experts and preferred to surround himself with those who flattered his ego rather than challenged him. He had a penchant for disregarding inconvenient facts, just as Nero dismissed the truths presented by those around him. Trump's disdain for complexity and truth led to disastrous decisions, much like Nero's refusal to face the reality of his regime's corruption. Both men were more concerned with creating a false reality that suited their desires than with addressing the real issues at hand. The Stoics teach us that when a leader's priorities are misplaced, when they focus more on their image and power than on the well-being of their people, chaos is inevitable. Nero, like Trump, was a leader who destabilized everything he touched, from his relationships to his empire, all because he couldn't accept the truth about himself or the world around him. The Stoic lessons here are clear. A good leader must embrace reality, act with integrity, and cultivate virtues like humility and wisdom, or they will inevitably fail. Key 1. Stoic narcissism in leadership is an incredibly destructive force. When a leader's primary concern is themselves and their own image, they are incapable of truly serving the people they are meant to guide. Their entire existence revolves around their own reflection, leaving little space for empathy, accountability, or growth. A prime example of this is Donald Trump. He used his platform not to unite or inspire, but to attack his enemies, lash out at critics, and turn even times of national celebration, like Thanksgiving, into opportunities for personal vengeance. His excessive vanity and self-obsession were evident as he compared himself to the likes of Abraham Lincoln, which only emphasized his delusion and arrogance. What's most troubling about such narcissistic leaders is not just their grandiosity, but their utter refusal to take responsibility. Trump's infamous claim during the pandemic that he wouldn't take responsibility for anything epitomizes the abdication of true leadership. As Harry Truman famously said, "The buck stops here." A real leader owns their mistakes, especially during crises, as these moments define their capacity to guide. Narcissists, however, are incapable of admitting fault. They cannot bear to confront their own imperfections, stunting their ability to learn and grow. This denial of accountability makes them not only ineffective but dangerous. People who could offer genuine counsel, like General Mattis or General McMaster, often find themselves pushed out by such leaders because narcissists surround themselves with sycophants who reinforce their delusions. This leads to a toxic environment where constructive criticism is absent, and the leader's worst impulses are allowed to dominate. Take Trump's dismissal of General John Kelly, his chief of staff, as a prime example. Kelly had warned him that his behavior would lead to impeachment, and in the end, that's exactly what happened. Trump's refusal to accept defeat in the 2020 election, much like the tragic figure of the Roman populist Catalan, led to an attempt to subvert the democratic process. His inability to handle defeat incited violence, culminating in the January 6 Capitol riot, a dark chapter in American history that mirrored the dangerous populist rhetoric of ancient Rome. Contrast this with George Washington's response during a similar crisis. When disgruntled soldiers in the Continental Army threatened to overthrow the government due to unpaid wages, Washington stepped in, using wisdom and authority to calm the situation and avert disaster. On January 6th, Trump's response was the opposite. He stoked the violence by refusing to intervene, mocking those who urged him to act. This is a hallmark of narcissism, echoing the behaviors of figures like Nero, who ignored the suffering of his people during the Great Fire of Rome. The Stoics, such as Seneca, warn about the dangers of narcissistic leaders and the mob mentality they often exploit. They understood that such leaders, driven by ego and resentment, could not be trusted with power. The fall of the Roman Republic was not a single event, but a series of escalating crises fueled by leaders who pandered to the mob. The Stoics recognized that allowing such figures to rise to power would only lead to chaos and destruction. Trump's behavior is a stark reminder of why we must demand virtue from our leaders. True leadership is about serving others with courage, justice, and wisdom, not inflating one's own ego or seeking revenge. We must stand against the mobocratic spirit that seeks to tear down everything in its path. As citizens, we cannot tolerate leaders who foster division, chaos, and violence. We must hold our leaders accountable and demand that they embody the virtues of self-discipline, courage, and wisdom. Ultimately, the Stoic ideal is clear: we need leaders who are committed to virtue, not to their own egos. Narcissistic leaders like Trump lead us into darkness, but through virtue and wisdom, we can navigate toward a brighter, more stable future. True leaders are those who serve the people, not themselves. We must aspire to elect such leaders and hold them to the highest standards of integrity and responsibility.